This is lecture 20, and it's the third of my lectures on Moby-Dick. And finally, I'm going to talk about Ahab. He, of course, is the larger-than-life person who matches the larger-than-life creature. He is, as I want to show, very much an American product of the mid-19th century. That Melville is really keeping covenant with the great tenets of American Romanticism as Emerson articulated them. At the same time, Ahab simply runs off any map we have for him. He represents, I think, Melville at his most adventurous, Melville at his most interrogatory, and at his most tragic. And in every one of those venues, there's simply nothing like him. There's nothing like him in the 19th century. You might say he starts from Emerson, but he ends up somewhere totally elsewhere. But I want to start with Emerson. I mean, Melville really constructs Ahab, because it's the right verb to use. I mean, after all, he didn't know Ahab. He hadn't read about Ahab. He makes Ahab as a very indigenous American product. He's a Quaker hero. That's not an innocuous remark, because it's an effort on Melville's part to say that you could create a hero out of these ordinary Yankee materials. You could take a Nantucketer and turn that into a creature who has the same prestige, the same stature as Zeus or one of the great kings of old. Ahab, as is the case for many godlike figures, is referred to and cited prior to being seen. That is to say, people talk about him as like a preparation for his entry on the scene. In particular, two other sea captains, whaling captains, who sign on Ishmael and Queequeg, Captain Bildad and Captain Peleg, refer to Ahab with great reverence, really, great admiration. The phrase, however, is remarkable. He is a grand, ungodly, godlike man. It says a lot of what Melville's up to. Ungodly, godlike. That he is going to be not quite the atheist principle, but he's going to have a war with God, at least with the traditional Christian version of God, through his antagonism with Moby-Dick. And at the same time, he's clearly going to be promoted he's going to be deified by the operation of the text and by the operation of Melville's language. An ungodly, godlike man, Captain Ahab, doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, then you may well listen. Mark ye, be forewarned, Ahab's above the common. Ahab's been in colleges as well as among the cannibals, been used to deeper wonders than the waves, fixed his fiery lance in mightier, stranger foes than whales. His lance eye, the keenest and the surest that out of all our isle, being Nantucket. Here is really the very essence of our heroism. We stand by Ahab. I already alluded to the term sultanism that Melville invokes for Ahab, trying to capture, again, some of the exotic authority of Middle Eastern fables, comparing it in those same passages to being a dictator, which he is. He is a dictator on this boat. That's a generic condition. Melville will tell over and over the story of sea captains as dictators. He does it in Billy Budd as well. That's what the power system on the boat is. It's a very rigorous chain of command, and Melville frequently wants to explore the kind of dictatorial, tyrannical dimensions of this. But in Ahab's case, it's also, as I said, an effort to create out of American indigenous materials something new and heroic. To create a character who is at once, as I said, homespun and quite special. But Ahab, my captain, still moves before me in all his Nantucket grimness and shagginess. And in this episode touching emperors and kings, I must not conceal that I have only to do with the poor old whale hunter like him. And therefore all outward majestical trappings and housings are denied me. O Ahab, what shall be grand in thee, it must needs be plucked at from the sky and dived for in the deep and featured in the unbodied air. Those are, of course, all of the areas, all of the media, in some sense, where Melville is going to venture. He will pluck things from the deeps, from the air. All of this, in a sense, will be the environment against which Ahab takes his measure. It's also known, I've already alluded to the fact that the encounter with Hawthorne catalyzes Melville. It triggers something. It leads him to a richer possession of himself, of his own forces. And it leads to the much richer development of Ahab as a character, with this power of blackness that I alluded to, or the sense of the ego and going unfettered into eternity with it, with your carpetbag of ego and saying no to the world. But of course, Hawthorne is only one encounter, and you may remember I said that in that essay on Hawthorne, he compares Hawthorne to Shakespeare, all of which is to say that the encounter with Shakespeare is even more inspiriting than the one with Hawthorne. Shakespeare is the presiding genius of much of this book. Shakespeare is what makes the language of Moby-Dick, of spectacularly extravagant language, of absolutely swooning similes and metaphors, a language that just thumbs its nose up at any notion of realism or sort of a kind of mimetic imitation of the phenomenal surface of things. One of the features that he takes from Shakespeare is Shakespearean soliloquy. So this is a novel with soliloquy. I mean, in Shakespeare, of course, that is the device used for a single character in a situation where he's by himself to at least convey to the audience what he is thinking, which is, of course, not realistic. I mean, people don't usually talk out loud about themselves. But they do in Shakespeare, and some of the soliloquies of Hamlet and others are among the most famous things in literature. Ahab does it too. He sounds the Shakespearean note, and it's a very high-flown language that not everyone likes. One of his first speeches goes like this. It's described with scenic directions, the cabin by the stern windows, Ahab sitting alone and gazing out. I leave a white and turbid wake, pale waters, paler cheeks, where'er I sail. The envious billows sidelong swell to whelm my track, let them. But first I pass. This is not the language of any ordinary 19th century figure. First I pass. That's the imperial note. In the waters here, the billows that are envious, he is a creature greater than others. Dry heat upon my brow, oh, time was, when as the sunrise nobly spurred me, so the sunset soothed no more. This lovely light, it lights not me. All loveliness is anguish to me, since I can near enjoy. Gifted with the high perception, I lack the low, enjoying power. Damned most subtly and most malignantly, damned in the midst of paradise, good night, good night. This is histrionic, it's theatrical, it's melodramatic. It's, as I say, it's not everybody's cup of tea. He really behaves like a sultan. He speaks like a sultan. He speaks this grandiose rhetoric, a kind of grandiloquence. At times, it seems like it falls on its face. But that is going to be one of the major tonalities of this text. And as I said, it's going to usurp much of the story. We're going to hear less and less of Ishmael and more of Ahab as this long book sort of moves into its fuller gears. You all know, of course, the story that Ahab has been maimed by an encounter with the whale, with Moby-Dick. He has lost a leg. And, of course, he's wearing an ivory leg in the story. Here's how it's described. And if you're Shakespearean, you'll recognize some of the language here. And then it was that suddenly sweeping his sickle-shaped lower jaw beneath him, Moby-Dick had reaped away Ahab's leg as a mower a blade of grass in the field. No turbaned Turk, no hired Venetian or Malay could have smote him with more seeming malice. That last line about turbaned Turks and seeming malice, that's lifted from Othello. It's Othello's final speech right before he kills himself. Once in Aleppo, etc., a turbaned Turk, etc. So Shakespeare's all over this. But that, of course, is the great moment of injury and the birth of the diabolical revenge scheme. Small reason was there to doubt that ever since that almost fatal encounter, Ahab had cherished a wild vindictiveness against the whale. All the more fell for that in his frantic morbidness he at last came to identify with him not only all his bodily woes, but all his intellectual and spiritual exasperations. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they are left living on with half a heart and half a lung. All evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby-Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his entire race from Adam down, and then, unbelievable metaphor, and then as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. Like an explosion, but it's also a birth. It's a birth of all of this rage, and it's a rage that is enlisted to fight all of the evil that has existed throughout the world. That's what Moby-Dick personifies, incorporates for Ahab. He has lost a leg, but it stops being a personal vendetta. He transfers or sees, it's up to you to decide, in the whale, the evil principle incarnate. So that's the epic struggle here. It is a great revenge scenario. Moby-Dick is the incarnation of evil. Needless to say, not everybody would see it that way, and Melville has taken care to put on this boat people who will see it differently. Not just Ishmael, but Starbuck in particular, who is the second in command. Vengeance on a dumb beast, Starbuck says to him, that simply smote thee from blindest instinct? Madness. To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous. It's unchristian. Why? This is an animal. There was no malice. This was its instinct. How can you possibly see this as the figure of evil? Well, you have one of the most famous answers in literature. Hark ye again. The little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. It's one of the great lines of the book. All visible objects are but as pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me. He heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate, and be the white whale agent, or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. One of the really ecstatic speeches, I think, in the 19th century. Note how utterly theatrical it is. All objects, visible objects, are pasteboard masks. Now remember, when we talked about Emerson and Thoreau and the transcendentalist venture, it was to say that spirit resides behind matter. And the project of art and literature is to capture that and to express it. And both Emerson and Thoreau are wonderful at that. Notice how this has gone sour and also become fascinating. This is no longer a question of spirit residing behind matter. This is a question of the world being a deceit, a fraud, an illusion. That there are terrible things lurking out there. It's a charade. We've got to know what's behind it. And the only way to go behind it is not to peer in it, but to strike through it. It's an oppositional, agonistic model of pure conflict and rage. And it incites you to action. This is the Promethean figure. This is the man who does battle with the gods. This is the satanic Ahab, the Faustian Ahab, the person who extends the reach of humans. It's a new territory that Melville is charting here. It's like a territory of the soul. And in it, he makes some fairly astonishing kinds of discoveries through Ahab. As I said, Ahab usurps the book. It's Ahab's overweening ambition, to use a kind of Shakespearean term. Ahab's sense of boundless, not just rage, but the field, the illimitable field for his action, to take these men on this boat and pursue this creature across the earth and across the sea. Striking through the masks, then, this theatrical vision turns Emerson's transcendentalism into something, as I say, more sinister, more dramatic, more frightening. As you strike through the mask, you make extraordinary kinds of discoveries in this text. Melville writes that the core of the human enterprise, the deepest core, is woe. These are throwaway lines in some ways, but they always refer obliquely to Ahab. So therefore, that mortal man who hath more of joy than sorrow in him, that mortal man cannot be true, not true, or undeveloped. With books the same. The truest of all men was the man of sorrows. He's talking about Jesus. The truest of all men was the man of sorrows. And the truest of all books is Solomon's. And Ecclesiastes is the finest hammered steel of woe. Woe, then, is at the core. There is a wisdom that is woe, but there is a woe that is madness. And then this wonderfully homebred American metaphor here, a woe that is madness. And there is a Catskill eagle in some souls that can alike dive down into the blackest gorges and soar out of them again and become invisible in the sunny spaces. And even if he forever flies within the gorge, that gorge is in the mountains. So that even in his lowest swoop, the mountain eagle is still higher than the other birds upon the plain, even though they soar. There's a wonderful kind of pride here, that this man who reaches so deep, Ahab, and goes into these depths of woe, and then we shall see of madness as well, and that we can think of as descending, swooping, that is still higher than other birds that soar, because this all takes place in the mountains. This wonderful domestic image here, I call it domestic in the American sense, it's not a household image, but this homespun sort of botanical image of the eagle, a certain kind of Catskill eagle that is going to be used here to kind of represent the power and the beauty of this project of Ahab's. That's the American kind of language he can develop. But of course, needless to say, this man is also inspired by Shakespeare, and he's also inspired by writers of antiquity. And so that as he tries to articulate Ahab's madness, Ahab's descent, he creates very bold and striking metaphors for us. Human madness is oftentimes a cunning and most feline thing. When you think it fled, it may have but become transfigured into some still subtler form. Ahab's full lunacy subsided not, but deepeningly contracted. And now he's going to compare it to a river, to the Hudson River. Like the unabated Hudson, when that noble Northman flows narrowly but unfathomably through the Highland Gorge. In other words, the banks get closer together, but it just means the river's deeper. But as in his narrow-flowing monomania, not one jot of Ahab's broad madness had been left behind. So even when this man looks like he's in control of himself and proceeds to behave as a captain on a whaling boat should, the madness is still there. It's all the deeper for being less wide. So that in that broad madness, not one jot of his great natural intellect had perished. That before living agent now became the living instrument. I've always wondered about that line. And what I think he's saying is that the madness takes over the person. And it takes over the intelligence. The intelligence had been agency, and now it becomes instrument. The intelligence now serves the madness in Ahab. I want to push this point because I think what Melville is up to in the depiction of Ahab is an astoundingly modern conception of human beings. I'd link it to Lacan, contemporary thinking about alterity of the human subject. Madness is going to be the other Ahab. He's going to be taken over by this diabolical plot to attack the whale, to get rid of the whale. And it's going to be described as a takeover. But the further down you go in this man, the stranger vistas become visible to us. He said, "This is much, yet Ahab's larger, darker, deeper part remains unhinted. Winding far down from within the very heart of this spiked Hotel de Cluny," what a reference. The Hotel de Cluny is a place in Paris where underneath it we have the ancient Roman thermal baths. That's going to be the metaphor for the human subject, that we have these remains on top, but what's really interesting are the catacombs underneath, the older relics still, the maimed gods that are still lower. Winding far down from within the very heart of this spiked Hotel de Cluny where we stand, however grand and wonderful, now quit it and take your way, ye nobler, sadder souls, to those vast Roman halls of Thermes, where far beneath the fantastic towers of man's upper earth, his root of grandeur, his whole awful essence, sits in bearded state, an antique buried beneath antiquities, enthroned on torsos. It's a remarkably sort of layered, vertical sense, almost a kind of archaeological sense of the human subject. That Ahab presents that kind of depth, that the further down you go, you find still further buried gods that somehow energize, empower this man that he's drawing from. That's the madness, that's the kingdom beneath. It's paralleled frequently with Prometheus, with the vulture that takes over the human subject as well, and its project of revenge. Ahab is going to be described as a person who is vacated in some strange way. He loses himself. As I said, this is what to me is most modern about the character. And he sees it. He knows it, that he has not just been lost, but has somehow been absconded with. What is it, he says? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening, hidden lord and master and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab, Ahab? It's a great line. Is Ahab, Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? Wonderful questioning about agency. What makes us do what we do? Where is the source? And I referred you that a moment ago to that reference of that descent into the catacombs or into the baths, the Roman baths, to find the earlier God still. But if the great sun moveth not of himself, but is an errand boy in heaven, nor one single star can revolve but by some invisible power, how then can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I? By heaven, man, we are turned round and round in this world, like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike. And he looks at the windlass on the boat and returns to the sort of nautical emblems that are right there in front of him. That's the lack of agency we have, the lack of control. We are moved by forces. We don't know what names to put on them. Well, I'm suggesting that there's a kind of vacated self that appears in this. And it's a definition of madness as the act of being vacated, of having some ruling passion that takes you over, that scripts you, that moves you, that directs you. One of the most fascinating turns in this text is the way this becomes personified in the figure of the little black cabin boy, Pip, who, as you may remember, falls overboard during one of the whale hunts and almost drowns. He sinks to the bottom of the sea, and he comes back up, and he's lost his mind during that time. And Melville beautifully describes what Pip has seen in the water, in the depths, because he has done what the whales do. He has gone under and lived and not quite died, and has returned, as it were, to tell his story. But from that hour the little Negro went about the deck an idiot, such at least they said he was. The sea had jeeringly kept his finite body up, but had drowned the infinite of his soul, not drowned entirely, though. Rather carried down alive to wondrous depths, where strange shapes of the unwarped primal world glided to and fro before his passive eyes. And the miser merman wisdom revealed his hoarded heaps, and among the joyous, heartless, ever juvenile eternities, Pip saw the multitudinous, God omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament of waters heaved the colossal orbs. And here comes the famous line. He saw God's foot on the treadle of the loom and spoke it. And therefore his shipmates called him mad. He has seen the indifference of the universe. So man's insanity is heaven's sense, and wandering from all mortal reason, man comes at last to that celestial thought which to reason is absurd and frantic, and weal or woe then feels uncompromised, indifferent as his God. So that the blank idiot, the little black boy who no longer has any sense of things, has seen the foot of God. I think this is going to take us in the direction that Melville is moving, which is fundamentally an absurdist picture of the world. That to enter the depths is not necessarily to discover evil, it's to discover blankness, nothingness. It's going to be called the whiteness of the whale in one of the famous chapters of this book. All of the markers, all of the terms that we use, all of the categories that give us a measured moral universe, all of them are going to be eroded, or to come back to the term that I started Melville with, cannibalized. They're just going to be eaten up. They're not going to hold anymore. Blankness is going to be the feature of the universe here. That's what Pip sees. And that's what Ahab sees in Pip. Ahab sees that Pip will be his own undoing because Pip looks at the nullity of the world, has seen it, has seen God's foot on the treadle of the loom, and knows that if he keeps looking at this child, this witless idiot, then he will stop believing in his own Promethean project of killing the whale and ridding the universe of evil. Because that moral project depends on a kind of fixity that Pip denies, Pip erodes. And so you have this strange kind of dance between these two figures. He becomes Ahab's alter ego. And some of the most beautiful lines in the story have to do with Pip, who speaks the strange language. Pip, who looks for his own lost soul because he's lost it down there. Seek out one Pip, who's now been missing long. I think he's in those far Antilles. If you find him, then comfort him, for he must be very sad. For look, he's left his tambourine behind. I found it. Rig-a-dig, dig, dig, dig. He is the alter ego. He is the person who performs this kind of pas de deux with Ahab. Who art thou, boy? Ahab says to him. Bellboy, sir, ship's crier, ding, dong, ding, pip, pip, pip. 100 pounds of clay reward for Pip, 5 feet high, looks cowardly. Quickest known by that, ding, dong, ding. Who's seen Pip the coward? And Ahab looks at him and says, there can be no hearts above the snowland. O ye frozen heavens, look down here. Ye did beget this luckless child and have abandoned him, ye creative libertines. Here, boy, Ahab's cabin shall be Pip's home henceforth, while Ahab lives. Thou touchest my inmost center. Thou art tied to me by cords woven of my heartstrings. You remember my emphasis about the fraternalism in this book. Ishmael and Queequeg, the way in which two people can be drawn together. Here we have that fraternalism turned into something much, much more ghastly, a kind of alter ego, a kind of double, the monomaniac Ahab and the witless idiot Pip being bonded in some sense, one being a figure of the other. In one of the most beautiful passages, Pip becomes the captain of the boat. He's sent on by Ahab, and it's really quite lovely. Ahab knows that if he keeps watching him, he's going to could lose his own sense of purpose. And Pip says, no, I'll support you. I'll be your lost leg. And Ahab says, we can't be together. And he says, you be the captain. And he leaves the room. And Pip has this remarkable speech in which he becomes the captain of the boat. And he sits there and he pontificates and speaks and asserts his own witless, mad authority. He rules over the boat, as he does in the text. Thank you.